So, how would you describe the difference between the Iranian people and the regime that rules them?
You may have heard this being said before by Iranians, but we generally consider them to be an occupying force. They do not reflect Iranians. They don't reflect Iranian nationality. They don't reflect Iranian history, culture, poetry, none of it. This is a regime that came in basically through a coup, and from that point onward changed the dynamics, culture and infrastructure of Iran into this, reflection of this Islamic regime. They took our flag. They took away our lion and sun emblem, and they put, their Islamic text onto the flag, which is something, it's considered foreign to Iran because it came to Iran. Suffice it to say that Iranians are indigenously, you could say, Zoroastrian. This move to turn Iran into an Islamic republic was overwhelmingly rejected by the Iranian people because they do not identify with that ideology. I think the best comparison you could say would be if Hamas was ever, God forbid, successful in Israel and turned Israel into, the Islamic Republic of Palestine, let's say, and you asked, what is the difference between the Israeli people and Hamas? It's almost a laughable question. You can't put those two things into the same bracket, into the same sentence, because they are essentially mortal enemies. And that is the same answer to the question, what's the difference between the Iranian people and the IRGC? They are mortal enemies. They're not aligned in culture. They're not aligned in politics. They are not aligned in ideology. They are as opposite to each other as you can get. Persian culture is 7,000 years old, and we have similar values of liberal democracies, even though they've been expressed differently. And that is what, in general, the Iranian population aligns with over this ideological extremism, which is, for all intents and purposes, foreign to us.
Can you talk a little bit about the regime's obsession with Israel and why Israel occupies such a central place in the ideology and rhetoric of the regime?
I mentioned this so briefly when I was on Piers Morgan the last time about the fact that the regime has an eschatological vision of the elimination of Israel. And this is something that is enshrined in their charter. As most people know, it's death to Israel, death to the United States. So in 1979, the lie that the regime sold to the Iranian people was that the fight of good versus evil, or oppressed versus oppressor, which, as we know, is a sort of Marxist dynamic. So this oppressed-oppressor dynamic said that the way to free Iran and the people of the Middle East from the oppressor is to eliminate all forms of Western imperialism in Iran. Now, this at the time was a very successful narrative to galvanize the Iranian people into revolution. The reality behind why do they have this sort of anti-imperialist narrative when in fact it is them who are the empire builders. It is them who are the imperialists. It is them who sent their proxies out to Lebanon, to Yemen, to Gaza to expand their ideology, because with the existence of Israel in the Middle East, the sole Jewish nation, that disrupts Islamic hegemony. The Jewish nation cannot exist if the Islamic regime is going to build its emirate in the Middle East. And so what the regime has been specific about since its inception and in its charter is that it isn't just about creating the Islamic Republic in Iran. It is about exporting the revolution. Well, how are you going to export the revolution where you have this tiny state in the Middle East that is actually a liberal democracy that is not going to fall to your ideological extremism? And so from the very beginning, there has been this idea that for the Islamic regime to export its revolution across the Middle East, Israel, the Jewish nation, will have to fall. Now, of course, they can't come out and say that to the world because they just will essentially sound like the Nazis that they are. This is a Nazi regime. Let's just be clear. And so they disguise their Nazism behind anti-imperialist rhetoric. They tell the world, well, this isn't about the fact that we hate Jews or this Jewish nation. It's just about the fact that we hate imperialism. And in terms of this eschatological vision, which is, this idea that justice will arrive on earth once Israel falls, that goes to this theory they have of Mahdiism, the idea that the Imam Mahdi will return once Israel falls. Now, the regime has actually been heavily criticized by Islamic scholars who say that you have manipulated this text. The idea of Imam Mahdi returning has nothing to do with Israel, but that's exactly what they do. They take things from scripture, they manipulate it to make it against Israel. So all of this combined is either weaponizing anti-imperialist rhetoric or some type of manipulation of Islamic scripture to essentially justify the elimination of Israel, because Israel is the obstacle to their empire building and to the establishment of their emirate in the Middle East.
To what extent are there any rational actors in the regime that try to strike some kind of balance between what you just laid out in terms of the existence of Israel being a threat to the story of Iran's role in the Middle East, of the regime of the Islamic Republic's role in the Middle East? How do they strike a balance between that and the reality that pursuing the practical implications of that ideology could result in the regime being destroyed, right? Pursuing this obsession practically, pursuing it against Israel and pursuing it against America and pursuing it against the West has resulted in the situation that the regime finds itself in right now and found itself in back in June. So is there any effort by any senior influential player in the regime to try to strike that balance and say, yes, we have these ideological principles and commitments and passions and worldview, and at the same time, our pursuit of them is going to result in our destruction?
From my perspective, I don't think that there is this split that you imagine between extremists and rational actors. I think at the end of the day, if you find yourself in some type of high-ranking position in this regime, you are categorically an extremist. There's really no way around it. You can't be in Hamas and be a rational actor, right? But I think what it's more about is that extremist vision is tempered by how much they can get away with. It's not that, some of them split off and they're like, okay, we know this whole thing is a lie, so let's not do anything about it in reality. It's that the regime, for all intents and purposes, and all the actors within it genuinely do believe what they believe about Israel. It's just that they have to sort of be strategic about what they can do without getting hit back. And that's why October 7th is just a perfect example of that. October 7th is an example where the regime helped to fund, train, support Hamas for years, but there was never any type of coordination about specifically what date this would happen. They kept their hands clean. And that is generally how they move across the Middle East. And it's generally how they move in their strategy against Israel, keeping their hands clean while fueling and supporting groups that can do the work for them without the strikes coming back on them. And I think that this is why the world perhaps is confused about where this war has come from, because they haven't seen it being fought in the invisible for so long. It's been fought in the unseen for so long. It's been fought with disconnection for so long.
One of your social media posts, you laid out a diagram that really captures the left's moral confusion when it comes to Iran's regime. Can you walk us through that framework and the kind of mental gymnastics that leads some people to see the regime as the victim in this conflict?
So this began in the 1960s and 70s in the United States, where there was this sort of Marxist infiltration of the Western world. And it's really important for people to understand that the roots of the contemporary American West have been infused at its foundation with Marxism. And the Marxist story was a grand lie for all intents and purposes. But essentially, it had this very oversimplified binary that said that, all people in the non-Western world are oppressed, and the Western world is the greatest source of evil. Israel, the US, and the West are the greatest source of evil out in the world. And so this became sort of infused in the Western imagination. It became the story that was told in academia, in education, in culture, in society. Even entertainment was saturated with this idea of the West being the source of all evil. Now, that created a reality in the minds of the Western left that, in fact, the enemies of the West aren't bad, evil people. That's all Western propaganda. All they're doing is trying to resist the imperialism and the oppression of the West. Now, what that has done over time, especially for people who have sort of attached to this social justice narrative, in fact, attached their whole identities to this social justice narrative, is that it has convinced them that what is morally upright, what is righteous, is to be against the West in every circumstance and to consider that any actors from the non-Western world are just the oppressed uprising for liberation and democracy in their lands. Well, we know that it absolutely isn't what these actors are looking for. And so what I talk about in this video is that they sort of go into their own alternative reality. And once they are in this alternative reality where they've been trained to see the world through this way, what happens is that every act is twisted to confirm that narrative. So when they see, and it is so surreal to witness it with your own eyes, when you see people like, for example, going on Piers Morgan and saying things like, Israel is attacking 7 different countries. These are people who have seen with their own eyes, every single one of those terrorist groups in those countries attacking Israel first. And when Israel retaliates, their brains from this space of this alternative reality simply delete that information. Israel has unilaterally committed these acts. Why does the brain demand that it believes this? To convince it that their alternative reality is, in fact, fact, and delete everything that confirms the reality that they don't want to accept, because it collapses their entire narrative. And once it collapses their narrative, it collapses the identities that they have fused to that narrative. And so nothing can ever convince them otherwise. No amounts of corpses, no amount of casualties can ever convince them otherwise until they've been deprogrammed.
Do you think the reaction that you're describing would look different if Israel weren't involved in this war at all? Or put another way, do you think that this deprogramming that you would hope for or wish for could actually occur if Israel was not in the frame of this war?
In my book that I've just finished writing recently, and actually explains all of these things, I talk about this being a type of mind virus. The people who, believe these things are infected by this mind virus. But it's also important to understand that there are 2 sort of components of this mind virus that are collaborating at the same time. There is anti-Westernism, which is its own standalone sentiment, and then there is anti-Zionism. And in recent times, the 2 have sort of fused into one. So anti-Westernism and anti-Zionism have now sort of become one and the same. So what I would say to answer your question is, do I believe that it would be significantly different or less of a reaction if Israel wasn't involved? Yes and no. I do believe that there would be an anti-war movement still, but where you see the anti-Semitic neo-Nazi component of this protest is in the fact that not just that they oppose the war, that they blame the existence of the war and every part of this conflict on Israel. So that's how I think the 2 components both overlap and have their separation.
We're also hearing a lot of claims that this war violates international law. Again, some of those arguments are not necessarily being made in good faith for all the reasons that you're saying, and people have other reasons for being oppositional to this, what's happening right now, what the U.S. and what Israel and now others are dealing with in Iran. But let's just address it on the merits. How do you react to arguments that this is a violation of international law?
I mean, it's a selective invocation, right? When Hamas committed October 7th, which it violated, penetrated a boundary of a different sovereign nation, nobody said, oh, this violates international law. Oh, we're going into a sovereign nation that we have no business going in. So it's such a selective invocation that there is just absolutely no credibility to the claim of international law. Second of all, you're talking about striking the basis of a terrorist regime. If your primary concern is to try and make a case for this being against international law, well, then you're just showing us that your concern isn't actually liberation and freedom from oppression, as you so claim. It is, as I've been saying repeatedly, just about being against the West, just about being against the US, against Israel, and anything that they do. They never cared about international law when this regime was massacring tens of thousands of people in January. They never cared about international law when these proxies were throwing their rockets into the Red Sea. So I'm sorry, but I really don't give a damn about your quote-unquote international law. It doesn't even mean anything except a tool for your politics.
So I want to talk about the protest movement, which you have been tracking very closely and then I presume in contact with. Given the regime's brutal repression, especially the killing of what we understand to be tens of thousands of Iranians in the last couple months, it's astonishing, actually, that Iranians still are taking to the streets, could still be taking to the streets. But the numbers, as big as they are still a relatively small share of the population. And so one wonders whether or not that what has turned out so far, which again is the level of bravery and sacrifice is that these people are making is again awe-inspiring. But what would it take for this to become like the protest movement to reemerge in really big numbers and be a real tipping point in toppling this regime?
Well, every time these protests have been sparked throughout the years, and especially most recently, we are seeing a major turnout in virtually every city in Iran. But at the same time, we cannot ignore the chilling effect of the massacres that are committed every time they do protest. It isn't just about shooting them dead in the streets. It isn't just about blinding them. It is about coming into their homes in the middle of the night, dragging them into prisons and sentencing them to death by hanging, sometimes on cranes in public squares. And that we cannot overstate the extent of the chilling effect that has on people's ability to go out there and protest. What we are hoping for, the outcome that we're hoping for with this war in particular, this war on the regime is, and Trump has said this, it is, full and unconditional surrender of the Islamic regime. If that were the case, that the regime falls from this war alone, fantastic. However, if that's not the case, then what the Iranian people would be looking for is that the regime is so severely and significantly undermined, is on the verge of collapse. That's when you're going to see people appreciate the fact that they have more to gain than to lose by going out into the streets. And that's why it's so important that this war does achieve those objectives of either completely eliminating this regime or doing as much as it can to weaken the regime so that the people feel confident to come out into the streets and topple it themselves.
If you have a 401k or an IRA, please listen. Gold is at record highs. What many people don't know is this. You can move part of your retirement money legally and without tax penalties into physical gold you actually own. Alpha Omega Gold helps you do this through a gold IRA. Your gold is real. It is stored safely. It is in your name. Learn more at ao.gold/stand. Alpha Omega Gold is our sponsor, and they proudly stand with Israel.